This is the evolution of the telephone in my Gen X lifetime. Growing up in a typical Gen X household meant that you had a phone that was mounted on a wall, usually in the center of the house. Usually one, some families may have two, and it was a rotary phone, which meant you put your finger in the dial and you rotated it around to wherever, and then you let go and it went da 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 and back to zero, and then you kept going. If you made a mistake, there was no backspace. You hung up and you started all over again. From what I remember, you didn't need all the numbers though. So you have an area code, you have a prefix, and you have the actual phone number. And in our little town of 2,000 people, we all had the same area code, we all had the same prefix, and so only this was unique. And I believe to call locally, all you had to dial were these 5 numbers. If you needed to dial somebody in your area code but with a different prefix, then I believe you dialed all 7. And if it was a different area code, that meant long distance, which I think you had to dial a 1 and then all 10. This is going back a long time, but that's the best that I can remember. Regardless of the dialing with the old rotary phones, if you heard it ring and you didn't get to it in time, in other words, by the time you picked it up, the other person had already hung up, you didn't know who called. You had no idea. There was no way to leave a voicemail. They would just try back later if it was important, and that was perfectly okay. Eventually, the technology advanced to push-button phones. Now, these were still actually a rotary phone. In other words, you didn't push a button and hear a tone like you do the keys on a modern home phone. You would actually press the button and you would hear the clicking in the background because it was really just doing a rotary dial. The next advancement that I saw was a device that my uncle found at, I don't know, some garage sale or something and gave to me. And it was a big box that you put, I think it was like in line with the phone maybe. And by this time we had 2 phones, but just one number. So I had one upstairs and then the family had one downstairs, but same number, which meant you could listen in on each other's calls. Didn't necessarily know the other person was listening, which is pretty hard to imagine nowadays, not having that privacy. This box was something that would allow 2 things. One, it had a speaker over here, so you could have a speakerphone. This was the first exposure I had to that, where you could just call and you could be doing stuff over here, but be able to talk and hear the other person through a speaker. Obviously talk through a microphone that was attached down here. You also had presets, and this was the first exposure to that, where you had a whole bunch of different 1-button presets, and you'd write in the name, you'd program it, and you would press that and have a preset call, so you wouldn't have to dial the whole number every time. By the end of high school, there were a couple more advancements. One of them was *69. So let's say that somebody called you and you got to the phone just as they'd hung up. And so you didn't know who called. What you could do is hang up, pick up the receiver and press *69. And a robot voice would tell you what phone number had just dialed you. Of course, there had to be a counter to it. So we also had something called *67. And *67 was if you wanted to call somebody, you didn't want them to know who was calling, you could hit *67 first, then dial the number, and *69 didn't work because it was now private. The second was a phone utility called Watson, who, if you recall your history, was the first person that Alexander Graham Bell called on the first telephone. He called Watson. So this phone utility was on a computer that my uncle had given me as a hand-me-down, and he and his buddy had created this program called Are You OK? So Watson was inside of a computer at the time, and they used this utility that combined the actual computer with the phone system to create Are You OK? So what Are You OK did is, let's say you had someone at home and they lived by themselves, they were elderly, not in the greatest health. This utility would send Watson to call them and say, hey, are you okay? And if the person was fine, they would pick up the phone, they would just hang it up and everything was fine. If they didn't pick up the phone, the utility would call them a little bit later, and if there was still no answer, then they would send the emergency vehicle out and they would go check on said person. This utility actually saved a couple lives in the area where they were using it. I wasn't as slick with computers as my uncle was, so I used Watson for basically a glorified answering machine. So the computer stayed on all the time at home for an answering machine, and then I eventually took it to college and used it for an answering machine in the dorms there as well. By college, the telephones that we had in the dorm rooms had Touchtone, and this was a necessary evil. Well, it was necessary for the evil task of registering classes, and you could always tell who was in the process of registering for classes by the vulgarities spewing down the hallway from whoever was stuck with the 7 o'clock registration time in the morning. Not a pleasant experience, but we used our Touchtone phones to go through this, only to have the automated system tell us that class was no longer available, and it completely screwed up our schedule, and it was a headache. Anyway, we had those. By the end of college, there were a couple more advancements. And what we endearingly called the basement penthouse, which was a really dumpy basement apartment down the street from campus, we had a telephone, that was Touchtone. We had an answering machine. So we had the telephone, we had an answering machine, which was just a device with a little tape in it. And when someone called, so this kind of was in series, right? And someone would call, they could leave a message on this little tape, and you'd get home and rewind it, play it, and hear what they had to say. And we had one more thing that was new. We had caller ID, which was sort of a step up from the star 69. They had the technology, and now they put it in a little box, and basically, every time somebody called, their number would show up on caller ID. So our communication system now, instead of being one rotary phone, it was a three-piece system of a Touchtone phone, an answering machine, and a caller ID. Because we had caller ID, this was also the beginning of me ignoring phone calls in my life, because the caller ID would come up, and either I would look and say, man, I don't feel like talking to that individual, or it's a telemarketer or whoever it might be, and ignore the call, or I just didn't care, because if the phone rang and I was busy doing something else, I ignored it, but I knew that I now had the ability to go look later and say, oh, these people called, this one I actually feel like calling back, these I do not, and I could use it as a screening mechanism. Drove my roommate insane because I would be sitting right by the phone and refuse to answer it, but it was just a way that suddenly the dynamics of how we use telephones was changing a little bit. After leaving college and starting my first adult job, this would be in '98, let's call it, in my house that I was renting, I now had the three components we just talked about that I had in college, except it was all in one. It was one device that had an answering machine, a caller ID, and a phone all in one. Might have even had a speakerphone too. I can't remember if it did or not, possibly. But I had this one device. Because I was traveling about 90% of the time, I was really only home every other weekend. I was in a new state, so everybody I knew was, for the most part, out of state, which meant long distance. So I would come home, I would have messages, I would return calls, talk to family and friends outside of state. And I was quickly realizing that every month I was backing up against my $200 limit on long distance and having these incredible bills. So since I was traveling so much and spending so much on these long distance calls without real convenience of it, in 1998, be late that year, I bought my first cell phone. And it was a Nokia, and it was just a little very simple, that's a really awful picture. Very simple little phone with a fixed antenna. You had a little black and white screen and you had your numbers across here. But now voicemail was contained within the unit. So you'd go travel, you'd land, you'd hit the button and you had voicemail and you'd hear it magically out of this phone. Obviously it was really just connecting with your voicemail back at Mother Skynet or wherever and giving you your messages. This allowed me to have the phone for convenience while I was on travel. So I was able to use it for both work and for personal. This was the beginning of how companies interacted with cell phone use as well, because we were traveling, my coworkers and I, some of the guys had loaner phones that they would check out from the company, but you never knew if you were going to get the same one or not. So I just used my personal phone, which meant I only carried one phone that I could use for personal and if I needed it for work. Plus, it always was the same number. I wasn't confusing my family and friends or my customers with, oh, this week I'm on 5606 number or whatever it might be. The device was a pretty sturdy little unit, and the one thing I had to get for it was a protective case, only because the environment I was working in was very dusty, lots of plastic particles, and I wanted something that would keep particles from going into the keys or into the speaker or the mic or charging port or anything like that. The next phone I remember getting was the Motorola StarTAC. Now, when I still had my Nokia, one of my coworkers had a StarTAC and everybody was wowing and oohing and ahhing over it because it now had a flip phone feature, So instead of being a fixed like this, the StarTAC was hinged in the middle, so it would fold down on itself and you could carry it more concealed or discreetly, whatever, in your pocket, and it was just a little bit easier for that. It was also pretty thin profile wise, and then you had your little screen up here and you had all your buttons that were a lot sleeker and closer to the same height. It was just a nicer interface. The first one I had a pop-up antenna. And the reason this is kind of an important feature at the time is because everybody started getting afraid of brain cancer with these antennas on cell phones. We have this thing up next to our head, we're getting all this radiation, we're all gonna have brain cancer. So the flip phone was a way to say, hey, when you flip it open, you've got this barrier now that's protecting you from all that radiation. So that was a big deal as far as a feature goes. The next one I had, after probably losing that one in a bar or smashing it or something, was a fixed antenna down there, but it was still the same StarTAC and had those for quite a few years. Eventually the StarTAC was discontinued and I replaced it with another Motorola flip phone. And at this time, they kind of made it a little bit smaller, if I remember right. Had a little bit bigger screen perhaps. It seemed like it was just a little bit thicker than this, but it was still a pretty sleek, rounded phone, less square edges, more curvature to it, and kind of went through a couple of those for years. And these Motorola flip phones took me through about the 2004-2005. Now during this period, towards the end of that, which again, this would have been probably 04-05, I remember seeing a message show up on the screen. I had no idea how it got there, but that was my first text message, which again, this was new to me. I didn't realize that you could actually type messages. And as I thought about having to hit the keys multiple times to get the, because we didn't have a big keyboard, you had basically your telephone keys. So you'd have to press a button several times to get the character that you wanted. So it seemed like it was a real headache, and I thought, why would I do that instead of just call? It just wasn't well received for a lot of us at the time, but it was the beginning of text messaging. The next phone I got was the Motorola Razor, and this was what a lot of us look back at as almost our favorite phones of this era. The Razor was a cool, sleek flip phone like the StarTAC, except it had the modern appeal of the Motorola flip phones I've been using. But what was really cool is not only did you have a nice screen, color screen on the open portion, but when it was folded down, you had a screen out here that was color as well, because once you flipped it open, you answered the call. So this front screen allowed us back to the screening. We could see who was calling, and we could determine, do I feel like talking or do I not? And so you didn't have to answer that call like some of these other ones used to do. The other thing the Razor could do is take pictures and send and receive them via text. However, very few of us used those. We used email if we had pictures. We didn't send pictures by text. For one thing, it was because of the expense. Even the texts sometimes had cost associated with them. These were the days when we were always afraid we were going to end up in some middle of nowhere and have roaming fees that gouged us. So people were a lot more touchy about their phone bills and what kind of costs were going to hit us. And one of them, for the texts and especially for the ones with pictures, there was a higher cost associated. So we, in my circle, pretty much avoided sending pictures at that time. Everything changed significantly in about 2006 when I started a new job and got the first gen Blackberries. And it had this full QWERTY keyboard on it, as well as this black and white screen, and it had this dial on the outside so you could dial up and down. The other thing that was unique about the Blackberry is, besides having this full screen on it, you also had a connection that would allow email to come through the device. So this was the first device I had that allowed me to check and send and receive emails on a phone. And because you could do that, the big keyboard was handy because it made it so much easier to actually do the email functions from the device instead of just the normal 9-digit phone keypad. Soon after this model, that dial was replaced with something a little bit taller and maybe a touch narrower with a little bit more compact keyboard. Again, you had the full keyboard here, and now we had the Pearl. And the Pearl was like a roller controller or roller track or whatever you may have seen. Some video games had it, some more modern mice have had it. But you had the Pearl, and that replaced this. So you could scroll with the Pearl. The only thing about it is sometimes they got dirty or sweaty, grimy, and you had to pop the little cap around it, clean it up and put it back in. But the screens were getting better. You started seeing more color on them. Eventually there was the Storm. The Blackberry Storm had a full touch screen. The entire thing was touch screen. And it had a little keyboard that popped up. And the one person I knew who owned one of these hated it because every time he tried to answer a call, he'd put it to his ear, and the screen would think the ear was doing something on the screen as a function and screw up his call. So that was an early touch screen that nobody seemed to like. However, when you add these two together, you got the Blackberry Bold, I believe it was called. And the Bold was probably about my favorite because that one had a full keyboard down here that I loved. It had the Pearl, and it had touch screen function on it as well. So you could use touch screen stuff where it made sense, but you could also have this full keyboard at the same time. Now, the direction things were headed about that time was a world that we still live in that is Apple obsessed. However, I never have owned in my life an Apple product of any kind. And I went through the reasons why in the Computer Revolution video. But part of it also was that as these things eventually developed, you had your Apple train, But then you had your droids. And I ended up in the droids because I'd already been a PC guy with engineering stuff. I liked my MP3 player as opposed to a shuffle that didn't have to fight iTunes or anything. I could just drag and drop from my computer onto the MP3 player. I also like the flexibility of the droid because there's things like my radar detector app that is only made for droids because that system is just more flexible. So a lot of reasons why I always preferred my droids. You can love your Apples and that's fine. I like my droid. But whatever device you choose, this was really the beginning of the era of the smartphone, where you have a full touch screen regardless of what brand it is. You have very few buttons on the outside and everything is controlled by finger swipes and everything that you do through the screen. For me as a Droid user, what that meant is I've been through a series of Samsung either Galaxies, or I think I've had a couple of Notes in there as well, that have just steadily been evolving. If we think about just how we use these phones at the gym, we carry it with us, it connects via Bluetooth to the earbuds that we have, and it plays music through them for us to motivate us in our workouts. It also takes that music either from a massive storage space on the phone itself or by streaming it over some service. And if it's streaming it, then it's doing that because it connects to the Wi-Fi service at the gym and pulls it from the web all instantaneously while we're doing our workouts. Not only does the phone provide music to our ears via Bluetooth, but it generally connects to a fitness watch that we wear on our wrist. That fitness watch is able to track our workouts, our heart rate, whatever else that we're doing at the gym, sends it over via Bluetooth to your phone. That through Wi-Fi sends it to the cloud and stores it as part of our health data. And just look around the gym the next time you're in there. Phones are the most used piece of equipment in that building. It's either the girls in dental floss workout gear with these on tripods trying to catch some older dude looking at them, or it's people sitting on the bench holding it down so that if a hurricane comes it won't blow away while they check their phone with their neck at a perfectly 90-degree angle. And the phones don't have to have all the capability built into it. We have apps. So you download apps and the apps do everything from provide music and fitness tracking to online shopping, to getting movie tickets, to holding our concert tickets, holding our boarding passes, our credit cards for purchase in here. And after taking that flight to go to the concert, these phones with, for example, 5 cameras on the back of it are very capable of capturing pictures and video of the concert that we can blast to friends and family or to our social medias. It's incredible looking back, seeing just how much phones have evolved over the decades. They've gone from this box mounted in the center of the room with a curly cord to the receiver, and the only information passed either way was what was heard or spoken over that receiver. And that was assuming the call was made and we didn't miss the call. In comparison, these phones are completely mobile. They get a signal almost anywhere. We take them everywhere with us. And they don't even need a cord to charge anymore. You can just lay them on a charging pad and they'll charge that way. Yet they're connected to the entire World Wide Web and they have way more computing power than a good computer did a few years ago. Yes, our whole lives are controlled by these gadgets that we all carry around like adult pacifiers. Usually with them on, usually staring at them. I kid you not that I've seen more than once in a restroom, a guy standing at the urinal watching this as if something is so important that he can't look away. We rush to grab our phones to see who a message is from or who's calling, yet we don't respond instantly either. And it's nothing but pure panic for these users, or maybe addicts is a better word, to, heaven forbid, have a dying battery or not be getting a signal. These devices have become so much more than just a telephone. But can we even still communicate with them? Of course. We can text, email, send messages through a whole host of different social medias from Instagram to LinkedIn. We can quickly capture and send anything from pictures, video, audio, all from the palm of our hand instantly. The only thing people have really stopped doing is using these to call and talk live to other people, which was the whole point of the invention in the first place. I wonder how Alex Bell would feel if he saw that his invention that he created to connect people to each other had become the device most responsible for the fast decline in actual human connection. If you haven't done so, please click the link below to subscribe to the channel. Click the little bell for notifications, which you can do from your phone. And let's live for today.